My sister Emma rolled her eyes as I carefully arranged the good china for Sunday dinner, her voice dripping with familiar disdain. Sarah, you can stop pretending your husband is some big-shot military officer now. We all know Jake drives a desk somewhere in Colorado Springs. What she didn't know was that at that exact moment, Jake was in a secure briefing room 3 levels underground at NORAD, coordinating responses to a national security threat that would soon bring the most powerful aircraft in the world to our quiet suburban neighborhood. By the time the presidential motorcade pulled into our driveway 6 hours later, everything my family thought they knew about my life was about to change forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of what would become the most transformative day of my marriage started exactly like every other Sunday for the past 3 years. I stood in the kitchen of our modest ranch house in Colorado Springs, preparing for the weekly family dinner that had become both a tradition and a source of constant tension since Jake and I had moved back to be closer to my aging parents. The house itself was nothing spectacular, a 1,200 square foot structure built in the 1980s with beige carpet throughout and a kitchen that desperately needed updating. But it was ours. And more importantly, it was what we could afford on what my family assumed was Jake's modest military salary. What they didn't understand, what I couldn't explain without violating security protocols that governed every aspect of our lives, was that our humble living situation was entirely by design. I pulled the roast from the oven, checking it with the precision that 3 years of military life had drilled into me. Everything had to be perfect for these family gatherings, not because I enjoyed the elaborate productions, but because they provided the only opportunity to maintain relationships with people who had grown increasingly distant since I'd married into what they considered the uncertainty and instability of military life. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop, a text from my mother asking if I needed help with dinner preparations. The offer was genuine, but it came loaded with the kind of subtle judgment that had characterized our relationship since Jake and I had announced our engagement 4 years ago. She'd never said directly that she disapproved of my choice to marry a career military officer, but her concerns leached through in comments about financial instability, frequent relocations, and the challenges of building a normal family life. The truth was more complicated than anything I could explain to civilian family members who viewed military service through the lens of movies and news reports. Jake's actual role in the Air Force was classified at levels that made casual conversation about his work impossible. When relatives asked what he did for a living, I'd learned to offer vague responses about aerospace defense and systems coordination that were technically accurate but revealed nothing about the scope of his responsibilities. This ambiguity had created a narrative vacuum that my family had filled with their own assumptions. To them, Jake was a mid-level technician who spent his days maintaining computer equipment at Peterson Air Force Base, earning a modest government salary that explained our careful budgeting and reluctance to make major purchases. They saw our small house, our practical cars, and our conservative spending habits as evidence that military life hadn't provided the financial stability they'd hoped I would find in marriage. My sister Emma arrived first, as she always did, carrying a store-bought dessert and an attitude that suggested she was doing us a favor by attending. At 32, she was 2 years older than me and had built a successful career in pharmaceutical sales that provided the kind of lifestyle our parents considered appropriately ambitious. Her BMW sat in our driveway like a reminder of the choices I hadn't made, the financial success I'd supposedly sacrificed for love and patriotic duty. "How's Jake's computer job treating you?" she asked while I transferred the roast to a serving platter, her tone carrying the particular brand of condescension she had perfected since her last promotion. The question was designed to sound casual, but it carried implications about career advancement and professional recognition that she knew would sting. I'd learned not to rise to these provocations directly. "He's doing well," I replied, focusing on the task at hand. "He's been working on some important projects lately. The response was truthful, but deliberately uninformative, which only reinforced Emma's belief that I was embarrassed about Jake's limited career prospects. My parents arrived 20 minutes later, bringing with them the kind of strained cheerfulness that had characterized family gatherings since Jake and I had returned to Colorado Springs. My father, David Mitchell, was a retired insurance executive who'd spent 30 years building a regional agency that provided comfortable middle-class prosperity for our family. His understanding of military life was limited to what he'd absorbed from documentaries and news coverage, which painted a picture of noble service undermined by bureaucratic inefficiency and inadequate compensation. My mother, Linda, had worked as a high school guidance counselor before retiring 5 years earlier. Her concerns about my marriage were rooted in genuine care, but they manifested as persistent questions about our long-term financial planning and subtle suggestions that Jake should consider transitioning to civilian employment where his skills could be better utilized and compensated. The conversation during cocktails followed familiar patterns that had been established over months of these gatherings. Emma discussed her latest sales achievements and the vacation she was planning to Europe. My parents shared updates about their retirement activities and social commitments. I provided carefully edited news about our life, omitting anything that might prompt questions I couldn't answer honestly. The challenge of maintaining these relationships while protecting classified information had become exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated when Jake and I had decided to move back home. Military families stationed far from civilian relatives could maintain some mystery about their daily lives without appearing secretive or defensive, but living 20 minutes from my childhood home meant that every vague response and declined invitation was noticed and interpreted as evidence that my marriage was somehow lacking. Jake had been scheduled to join us for dinner, as he did most Sundays when duty permitted. But 40 minutes before my family arrived, he'd called to explain that something urgent had come up at work and he wouldn't be able to leave base. The explanation was routine. Military schedules were unpredictable, and last-minute duty assignments were common enough that my family had stopped expressing surprise when Jake missed social commitments. What they didn't know was that Jake's absence today wasn't due to routine maintenance work or administrative duties. For the past 6 hours, he'd been in continuous communication with senior Defense Department officials about a developing situation that required expertise in satellite communications and aerospace defense systems that very few people in the military possessed. The emergency wasn't something that could be discussed at family dinner tables, and its resolution would likely require resources and decision-making authority that extended far beyond anything my family imagined when they pictured Jake's daily responsibilities. As we moved from the living room to the dining room, the conversation shifted to topics that had become increasingly uncomfortable over the past year. Emma launched into a detailed description of her colleague's recent wedding, emphasizing the elaborate venue, the extensive guest list, and the honeymoon in Tuscany that demonstrated the kind of financial freedom that came with marrying well in civilian careers. "It must be nice to have that kind of stability," my mother added, her comment directed toward me with the subtle implication that my own choices had prioritized romance over practical considerations. Government jobs are secure, of course, but they don't really provide the same opportunities for advancement and wealth building. I served the roast in silence, letting the criticism wash over me without response. Defending Jake's career would require explaining aspects of his work that were classified beyond anything my family's security clearances would permit them to know. The irony was that they were criticizing the financial limitations of a career that actually provided compensation and benefits they couldn't imagine, working on projects that protected national security interests they took for granted. The truth about Jake's position in the Air Force was something I'd learned gradually over our 4 years of marriage. We'd met during my final semester of college when he was completing advanced training at a facility near campus. His initial explanation of his work had been as vague as the responses I now gave my family. Something about communications, technology, and defense systems that sounded technical but unremarkable. It wasn't until after our wedding that I began to understand the scope of his responsibilities and the reasons for the secrecy that governed our daily lives. Jake held one of fewer than 50 positions in the entire military that required his specific combination of technical expertise, security clearance, and strategic thinking. His work involved coordination with intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and international allies on projects that most Congress members weren't authorized to know about in detail. The compensation for this level of responsibility was substantial, but it came with restrictions that made normal displays of wealth impossible. Our conservative lifestyle wasn't the result of financial constraints. It was a security protocol designed to avoid attracting attention to families whose spouses worked in highly classified environments. The modest house, the practical cars, the careful budgeting, all of it was deliberate camouflage that protected both our safety and the integrity of Jake's work. But explaining these realities to family members would require violating security agreements that carried criminal penalties. So I endured their well-meaning criticism and let them believe that I'd chosen love over financial security, that military life was a noble sacrifice that came with real economic costs. The dinner conversation continued along predictable lines, with Emma describing her latest professional achievements and my parents offering updates about their retirement activities. I contributed when directly questioned, but mostly I focused on serving the meal and managing the logistics of hospitality that kept the gathering pleasant despite underlying tensions. As we were clearing the main course, Emma's phone rang with a call from her boyfriend Marcus, who was apparently dealing with some crisis at his accounting firm that required immediate consultation. She excused herself to take the call in the living room, leaving me alone with my parents for the first honest conversation we'd had in months. "Sarah," my father said carefully, his voice carrying the tone he'd used when I was a teenager, and he wanted to discuss something important without seeming to lecture. "We worry about you sometimes. Not because we don't like Jake. He's a good man, and we can see that he loves you. But military life is unpredictable, and we want to make sure you're thinking about your future realistically." My mother nodded in agreement, her expression mixing maternal concern with genuine confusion about choices I'd made that seemed to contradict everything they'd taught me about financial planning and career development. "You were such a strong student, and you had so many opportunities after graduation. It's just hard for us to understand why you'd choose a lifestyle that limits your options." The conversation was familiar, but tonight it felt particularly loaded with implications about my judgment and priorities. They weren't questioning Jake's character or our relationship directly, but they were expressing doubt about the practical wisdom of building a life around military service in an era when civilian careers offered more apparent security and advancement opportunities. I wanted to defend our choices, to explain that their concerns were based on fundamental misunderstandings about Jake's career and our financial situation. But doing so would require revelations that could compromise not just his work, but potentially national security interests that extended far beyond our family dynamics. Instead, I offered the same careful responses I'd been giving for 3 years. "We're happy, and we're building a good life together. Military service comes with challenges, but it also provides opportunities and experiences that civilian careers don't offer." The words were true but inadequate, and I could see in my parents' expressions that they interpreted my vague defensiveness as evidence that I was trying to convince myself as much as them. Emma returned from her phone call with news that Marcus's crisis had been resolved, but her boyfriend's important client meeting had reminded her of her own professional obligations. "Speaking of which," she said, settling back into her chair with the satisfied expression of someone about to make a point, "I've been meaning to tell you about this opportunity at my company. They're expanding their government relations division, and they're looking for people with connections to military contractors and defense agencies." The suggestion was offered as a favor, but it carried implications about my current situation that stung more than she probably intended. Emma was assuming that I was underemployed, that my education and capabilities were being wasted in a military wife role that provided limited professional opportunities. The irony was that my current work, managing the complex logistics of a classified military career, required skills that most corporate positions never developed.
But I couldn't explain any of this without violating security protocols that governed every aspect of our lives. So I thanked her for thinking of me and promised to consider the opportunity, knowing that I'd never pursue employment that might create conflicts of interest with Jake's classified work. The afternoon was wearing on, and I could feel the familiar exhaustion that came from maintaining careful conversations while protecting information that my family would never be authorized to know. These gatherings required constant vigilance about what could be shared and what had to remain secret, turning family relationships into complex exercises in strategic communication. As we moved to dessert and coffee, my phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. The content was brief and coded in language that would sound routine to anyone overhearing our conversations. "Meeting running late. We'll call you later with update." To my family, it would sound like standard military bureaucracy keeping a dedicated employee at work longer than expected. To me, it indicated that whatever crisis had required his urgent attention was still developing and would likely keep him away from home well into the evening. The message reinforced my family's assumptions about military life, that it was dominated by inefficient procedures and demanding schedules that prioritize institutional needs over family commitments. They couldn't know that Jake's current assignment was coordinating responses to threats that could affect millions of people, or that his expertise was being consulted by officials whose names they recognize from news coverage, but whose actual responsibilities they could never imagine. The conversation was beginning to wind down when Emma's phone buzzed with what appeared to be an urgent notification. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting from casual interest to genuine surprise. "That's weird," she said, showing the screen to my parents. "I'm getting emergency alerts about increased air traffic in the area, something about temporary flight restrictions." My father pulled out his own phone and confirmed similar notifications from local news apps and emergency management systems. The alerts were vague, but suggested that unusual aviation activity was expected in the Colorado Springs area, possibly related to military exercises or VIP transport that would affect normal flight patterns. I felt a familiar knot forming, the kind of anxiety that came when civilian emergency notifications overlapped with Jake's classified work in ways that I couldn't discuss with anyone. The timing of these alerts combined with Jake's urgent assignment suggested that whatever situation had developed might be more significant than routine defense exercises. But I couldn't share these concerns with my family without revealing information about Jake's actual responsibilities. So I joined their speculation about the flight restrictions while privately worrying about situations I wasn't authorized to know about in detail, even as a military spouse with high-level security clearance. The afternoon was ending on an unsettled note, with everyone slightly on edge about emergency notifications that seemed unusual but not immediately threatening. My family gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, offering the same polite thanks and promises to see each other soon that concluded every one of these gatherings. As I walked them to their cars, Emma paused beside her BMW and fixed me with the expression she had worn since childhood when she wanted to deliver advice that she considered essential but unwelcome. "Sarah, I know you love Jake, and I know military service is important, but you're 30 years old and you're living like you're still in college. Maybe it's time to think about what you want your life to look like in 10 years. The comment was intended as sisterly concern, but it revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about our actual situation. She saw our modest lifestyle as evidence of financial struggle when it was actually a security protocol. She interpreted my reluctance to discuss Jake's work as embarrassment when it was legal obligation. She viewed our choices as romantic idealism that needed to be tempered with practical reality when they were actually carefully calculated decisions based on information she would never be authorized to possess. I hugged her goodbye and promised to think about her advice, knowing that I would spend the evening worrying about Jake's safety while she returned her comfortable civilian life, confident that she understood the world better than her naive younger sister who chose love over financial security.
As their cars disappeared down our quiet suburban street, I returned to the house that suddenly felt too small and too quiet. The kitchen was filled with dirty dishes and the lingering aroma of Sunday dinner, but my mind was focused on text messages that meant more than my family could imagine and emergency notifications that might be connected to work they would never understand. The day had started like every other Sunday, but something in the air suggested that nothing would be quite the same by the time it ended. I just had no idea how dramatically everything was about to change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The house felt unnaturally quiet after my family's departure, filled with the kind of silence that precedes significant events. I moved through the familiar routine of cleaning up after dinner, loading the dishwasher and wiping down counters, while my mind raced with questions I couldn't voice aloud. The emergency flight notifications on everyone's phones had created an undercurrent of tension that lingered even after the conversation had moved on to safer topics. By 7:30, the kitchen was spotless, but Jake still hadn't called with an update about his extended meeting. In 3 years of marriage, I'd learned to read the subtle indicators that distinguished routine military duties from genuine crisis situations. Tonight felt different in ways that made my chest tight with anxiety I couldn't fully explain to myself, let alone share with anyone else. I settled into the living room with a cup of tea and tried to focus on the novel I'd been reading for weeks, but the words blurred together as my attention drifted toward every small sound outside. Our neighborhood was typically quiet on Sunday evenings, with most families settled inside preparing for the upcoming week. But tonight, there seemed to be more activity than usual. Distant sirens, the low rumble of heavy vehicles, and something else I couldn't quite identify. My phone buzzed with a text from my college roommate, Jessica, who lived in Denver and apparently received similar emergency notifications about flight restrictions in the Front Range area. "Any idea what's going on down there?" her message read, followed by a screenshot of news alerts that described elevated security measures and temporary aviation restrictions without providing specifics about the cause or duration. I typed and deleted several responses, unsure how to answer questions that touched on classified territory. Jessica knew that Jake worked in military communications, but, like my family, she assumed this meant routine technical support rather than anything that would give me insight into regional security operations. Her curiosity was natural, but satisfying it would require explanations that could compromise both Jake's work and my own security clearance. Instead, I sent back a vague response about military exercises being common in the Colorado Springs area, which was technically true, but deliberately uninformative. The exchange reminded me how isolated military families could become, surrounded by civilian friends and relatives who couldn't understand the constraints that governed seemingly simple conversations about daily life. The local news was covering the flight restrictions with the kind of measured speculation that characterized reporting on military-related events in areas with significant defense installations. Anchors mentioned increased activity at Peterson Air Force Base and Cheyenne Mountain, but their information was clearly limited to what public affairs officers had authorized for release. The coverage was professional, but vague, designed to inform the public about traffic disruptions without revealing operational details that could compromise security. I switched between news channels, searching for additional information, knowing that anything truly significant would be classified far beyond what local reporters could access. The exercise felt futile, but it provided a distraction from the growing anxiety that came with being married to someone whose work occasionally intersected with events too sensitive for public discussion. At 8:15, my phone rang with Jake's number, and I answered before the second ring with relief that surprised me with its intensity. His voice carried the careful tone he used when discussing work-related topics on unsecured lines, professional but deliberately neutral in ways that revealed nothing about the actual substance of his day. "Hey, beautiful," he said, the warmth in his greeting somewhat undermined by the exhaustion I could hear beneath his words. "Sorry I missed dinner with your family. How did that go?" The question was routine, but I could detect the slight strain that suggested his mind was still focused on whatever crisis had kept him at work for the past 10 hours. I gave him a brief summary of the afternoon's conversation, emphasizing Emma's latest career achievements and my parents' continued concerns about our financial stability, while carefully avoiding any mention of the emergency notifications that had disrupted the end of our gathering.
Jake listened with the focused attention he always gave to my descriptions of family interactions, asking follow-up questions about my parents' retirement plans and Emma's vacation preparations that demonstrated genuine interest despite whatever pressures he was managing at work. "I might be late getting home tonight," he said after I finished recounting the afternoon's events. "This project is turning out to be more complex than we initially anticipated, and there are some coordination issues that need to be resolved before tomorrow morning." The explanation was standard for Jake's work, where projects and coordination issues could refer to anything from routine software updates to international crisis management. The ambiguity was necessary for operational security, but it left me constantly guessing about the significance of his assignments and the level of stress he was managing without being able to discuss it openly.
"Should I wait up for you?" I asked, though we both knew the answer depended on classified timelines I wasn't authorized to know about. "Probably better not to," he replied, his tone carrying the apologetic note that always accompanied indefinite work schedules. "But I'll try to call if things wrap up earlier than expected." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, covering mundane topics like grocery shopping and household maintenance that provided comforting normalcy despite the underlying tension of unexplained work crises. Jake's ability to maintain casual conversation while managing whatever emergency had consumed his day was impressive, but it also highlighted the degree to which our relationship existed in carefully separated compartments of classified and civilian life. After we hung up, I returned to my novel, but found concentration even more impossible than before. The combination of my family's criticism, the emergency notifications, and Jake's extended absence created a perfect storm of anxiety that no amount of rational self-talk could completely dispel. I was accustomed to the unpredictability of military schedules, but tonight felt weighted with significance that extended beyond routine operational demands. The news coverage had shifted to national stories, but local stations continued to provide periodic updates about flight restrictions that were affecting commercial aviation throughout the Denver metro area. The disruptions were significant enough to strand travelers and delay cargo shipments, suggesting that whatever was happening involved more than routine military exercises or training operations. I tried calling my friend Madison, whose husband was stationed at Peterson Air Force Base, in a logistics role that occasionally provided insight into unusual base activities, but her phone went straight to voicemail, which could mean anything from family obligations to her own spouse being involved in whatever operation was requiring extended duty hours across multiple military installations. The isolation was familiar, but particularly acute tonight, surrounded by civilian neighbors who could speculate freely about unusual events, while I remained constrained by security obligations that prevented me from either seeking or sharing information that might provide clarity about Jake's situation. Military spouses developed high tolerance for uncertainty, but that didn't make the experience less stressful when personal relationships intersected with classified operations. By 9:30, I had given up any pretense of reading and was pacing between the living room and kitchen, checking my phone compulsively for updates that weren't coming. The Sunday evening routine that usually provided structure and comfort felt hollow when Jake's absence extended indefinitely without explanation beyond the standard terminology of military necessity. I decided to take a bath, hoping that the familiar ritual of warm water and lavender oil would help settle my nerves before attempting to sleep, despite Jake's uncertain schedule. Our bathroom was small, but comfortable, with a deep soaking tub that had been one of the house's selling points when we'd been searching for affordable housing near his duty station. As the tub filled, I heard what sounded like heavy aircraft passing overhead, flying lower than commercial traffic, but without the distinctive noise signature of the military training flights that were common in our area. The sound was brief, but unusual enough to draw my attention toward the bathroom window, though the darkness outside revealed nothing but the familiar silhouettes of neighboring houses and streetlights. The aircraft noise was followed by what might have been convoy vehicles on the main road several blocks away, though the distance made it difficult to distinguish emergency response traffic from normal evening transportation. These sounds would have been unremarkable in many military communities,
but our suburban neighborhood was typically quiet enough that unusual activity was noticeable even when it occurred on nearby military installations. I settled into the bath with my phone within reach, knowing that Jake would call if he could, but also aware that truly significant operations often required communication blackouts that could last for hours or even days. The water was soothing, but my mind remained alert to every sound outside, searching for patterns that might provide clues about the scope and duration of whatever situation had disrupted our normal evening routine. The local news app on my phone provided periodic updates about flight restrictions that were now affecting airport operations as far away as Denver International, with incoming flights being diverted to alternative airports and departure delays extending into Monday morning. The scale of the disruption suggested coordination between multiple agencies and installations, pointing towards something more significant than routine training or maintenance operations. I tried to focus on the relaxing aspects of the bath, but my awareness of Jake's extended absence made relaxation impossible. In the early months of our marriage, I had struggled with the unpredictability of military schedules and the way classified work could eliminate normal communication patterns without warning. Experience had taught me to manage anxiety more effectively, but tonight's combination of family stress and operational uncertainty was testing coping skills I thought I had mastered. The house phone rang just as I was considering getting out of the bath, and I wrapped myself in a towel to answer what I hoped would be Jake calling with an update about his evening schedule. Instead, the caller ID showed my mother's number, which was unusual for Sunday night conversations, unless something specific had prompted her to reach out. "Sarah, honey," she began, her voice carrying the slightly worried tone she used when current events intersected with her maternal instincts. "I've been watching the news about these flight restrictions, and my father and I are wondering if Jake's work might be affected by whatever's happening at the military bases." The question was natural from parents who had limited understanding of military operations, but genuine concern for their daughter's welfare. My mother's inquiry was motivated by love rather than curiosity, but answering it honestly would require revealing information about Jake's actual responsibilities that I wasn't authorized to share even with immediate family members.
"I'm sure it's just routine exercises," I replied, using the same careful language that had become second nature when discussing anything related to Jake's work. The military conducts training operations regularly, and they don't usually affect family schedules unless there's a major deployment. My response was technically accurate, but deliberately misleading, designed to reassure my parents without providing information that could compromise operational security. The balancing act was emotionally exhausting, requiring constant vigilance about what could be shared and what had to remain protected, even from people whose only motivation was caring about my welfare. My mother seemed satisfied with the explanation, though I could detect the underlying concern that characterized her approach to anything involving military life. She had never fully adjusted to the idea that her daughter's marriage existed partly in a classified world she couldn't access or understand, and her questions often reflected deeper anxieties about security risks and family stability that she couldn't articulate directly. After reassuring her that Jake and I were safe and that the flight restrictions weren't affecting our immediate plans, I ended the call and returned to the cooling bathwater, feeling more isolated than before. The conversation highlighted the ways that military families existed in parallel worlds, connected to civilian communities, but separated by security requirements that made honest communication impossible about significant aspects of daily life. I drained the tub and got ready for bed, though sleep seemed unlikely given Jake's continued absence and the background noise of unusual aircraft activity that had persisted throughout the evening. Our bedroom faced away from the main road, but the house's single-story construction and older windows provided minimal insulation from outside sounds, particularly the low-frequency rumble of heavy vehicles or aircraft that seemed to be occurring intermittently throughout the night. As I settled under the covers with my phone charging beside the bed, I tried to focus on the novel I had abandoned earlier, but concentration remained impossible. The combination of family criticism, operational uncertainty, and the physical discomfort of sleeping alone when Jake's schedule was unpredictable created a perfect storm of insomnia that no amount of rational thinking could overcome. The bedside clock showed 11:45 when my phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. "Still working. Don't wait up. Love you." The message was brief and uninformative, but the timing suggested that whatever crisis had required his attention was continuing well into the night and would likely extend into Monday morning. I replied with a simple, "Love you too, stay safe," knowing that he might not be able to respond immediately, but wanting him to know that I was thinking about him, despite the constraints that prevented us from discussing what was actually happening at his workplace. The house settled into the kind of quiet that characterized late Sunday nights, but the unusual activity outside continued sporadically, with occasional aircraft noise and distant vehicle traffic that suggested ongoing operations at nearby military installations. I lay in the darkness listening to sounds that were probably routine for people who lived closer to active air bases, but which seemed significant tonight because of their timing and Jake's extended absence. Sleep finally came sometime after midnight, but it was restless and interrupted by dreams that mixed family criticism with vague anxieties about Jake's safety and professional responsibilities I couldn't fully understand. The last thing I remembered before truly losing consciousness was the sound of what might have been another heavy aircraft passing overhead, flying lower and slower than any commercial traffic I had ever heard in our quiet suburban neighborhood. Monday morning would bring answers to questions I didn't even know I should be asking, but that night I fell asleep to the distant sound of events in motion, unaware that our carefully compartmentalized life was about to become the center of attention from people whose interest would transform everything my family thought they knew about our modest military marriage. Monday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Jake's side of the bed was still empty when my alarm went off at 6:30, and his absence felt more pronounced in the gray dawn light filtering through our bedroom curtains. I checked my phone immediately, hoping for an update about his schedule, but found only the message from the night before and a new text that had arrived sometime during my restless sleep. "Busy day ahead. Will call when I can." The brevity of his communication was typical for periods when his work entered classified territory, but something about the timing and tone felt different this morning. Jake usually managed brief check-ins even during extended operations, and his messages typically carried more warmth despite their necessary vagueness. Today's text felt purely functional, as if personal communication had become secondary to whatever crisis was demanding his complete attention. I went through my morning routine mechanically, showering and dressing for my part-time job at the base library, while monitoring local news for updates about the flight restrictions that had disrupted Sunday evening. The coverage had expanded overnight, with reporters now mentioning coordinated security measures and elevated readiness levels at multiple military installations across the region. The language was careful and uninformative, but the scope of the restrictions suggested something more significant than routine exercises or equipment testing. Commercial aviation was still experiencing delays, and several major highways near military facilities had temporary traffic control measures that were affecting commuter patterns throughout the Colorado Springs metropolitan area. I drove to work through neighborhoods that looked entirely normal on the surface, but my heightened awareness picked up subtle signs of increased security activity. More military police vehicles were visible at base entrances, and the usual stream of civilian contractors and government employees seemed heavier than typical for a Monday morning. These observations could have been coincidental, but they reinforced my growing sense that Jake's extended absence was connected to something substantial.
The base library, where I worked part-time, was located in a building that served both military personnel and their families, providing a neutral environment where classified and civilian worlds could coexist without conflict. My position required basic security clearance, but not access to operational information, which made it perfect for someone married to someone whose work involved much higher classification levels. My supervisor, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, was a retired Air Force officer who had spent 30 years managing military libraries before transitioning to civilian employment. She understood the unique challenges facing military families and had created a workplace culture that accommodated the unpredictable schedules and security constraints that characterized life on active duty installations. "You look tired this morning," she observed as I settled into my desk in the reference section. "Everything all right at home?" The question was motivated by genuine concern rather than curiosity, but answering it honestly would require explanations about Jake's work that I couldn't provide, even to someone with military background and appropriate security clearance. Mrs. Henderson's question was the kind of routine inquiry that had become complicated by the classified nature of Jake's actual responsibilities. "Jake had to work late last night," I replied, which was technically accurate while revealing nothing about the scope or significance of his assignment. "Military schedules, you know how it is." Mrs. Henderson nodded with the understanding that came from decades of experience with operational demands that could disrupt family life without warning or explanation. Her acceptance of my vague response was comforting, but it also highlighted how even sympathetic colleagues couldn't provide the kind of support that required knowledge about what was actually happening in classified environments. The morning passed quietly, with routine tasks that provided welcome distraction from my anxiety about Jake's continued absence. I processed returned books, helped patrons locate research materials, and updated catalog entries with the kind of focused attention that comes from needing mental occupation during periods of personal uncertainty. Around 10:30, I noticed increased activity outside the library windows, with more official vehicles and personnel moving through the base with apparent urgency. The activity wasn't dramatic enough to disrupt normal operations, but it was noticeable to someone who had learned to read the subtle indicators of elevated security status on military installations. Mrs. Henderson had apparently noticed the same increased activity because she returned from her coffee break with a thoughtful expression and news that the base commander had issued updated guidance about visitor procedures and identification requirements that would take effect immediately. The changes were described as temporary security enhancements, but they suggested that whatever situation had developed was significant enough to affect routine operations across the entire installation. "Any word about how long these enhanced procedures will be in effect?" I asked, hoping for information that might provide clues about the duration of Jake's current assignment. "Nothing specific," Mrs. Henderson replied, her tone carrying the neutral professionalism that military personnel used when discussing security matters that couldn't be elaborated on in public settings. "Could be a few days, could be longer. Depends on how things develop." Her response was deliberately uninformative, but the timing of the security enhancements coincided too closely with Jake's extended absence to be coincidental. Something was happening that required coordinated response across multiple installations and agencies, and Jake's expertise was apparently essential to whatever resolution was being pursued. I tried to focus on my work, but concentration became increasingly difficult as the morning progressed. The combination of Jake's mysterious absence, the visible security enhancements, and my family's continued misunderstanding about our financial situation created a perfect storm of anxiety that no amount of routine library tasks could completely dispel. Just before noon, my phone buzzed with a call from Emma, whose tone immediately signaled that she had news she considered significant. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I talked to Marcus about opportunities at his accounting firm. They have a government contracts division that might be perfect for someone with your background." The suggestion was offered with the enthusiasm Emma typically brought to solving other people's problems, but it revealed how completely she misunderstood both my current situation and my capabilities. She was assuming that I needed career assistance when in fact my part-time library position was deliberately chosen to accommodate the security requirements of Jake's classified work. "That's thoughtful of you," I replied, trying to balance gratitude for her concern with the reality that civilian employment and government contracting could create conflicts of interest with Jake's security clearance. "I'm pretty happy with my current position, but I appreciate you thinking of me." Emma's response carried the slightly frustrated tone she used when her advice wasn't immediately embraced. "Sarah, you're working part-time at a library. That's not building a career, that's just filling time. You have a college degree and real potential, but you're limiting yourself to fit into this military wife role. The criticism stung because it was based on assumptions about my choices that I couldn't correct without violating security protocols. Emma saw my part-time employment as evidence of limited ambition when it was actually a strategic decision designed to support Jake's career while maintaining my own professional skills and security clearance. "I need to get back to work," I said, ending the conversation before it could develop into the kind of extended discussion about my life choices that had become increasingly uncomfortable over the past year. The call left me feeling more isolated than before, surrounded by well-meaning family members who couldn't understand the constraints that govern my professional decisions. Their criticism was motivated by genuine care, but it was based on fundamental misunderstandings about military life that I couldn't correct without compromising Jake's work.
The afternoon brought more visible signs of unusual activity on the base, with official vehicles arriving at buildings that typically had minimal traffic and personnel moving with the kind of focused urgency that characterized significant operations. The activity wasn't dramatic enough to alarm civilian visitors, but it was noticeable to anyone familiar with the normal rhythms of military installations. Mrs. Henderson received a call around 2 o'clock that required her to attend a brief meeting about updated security procedures, leaving me alone in the library with instructions to direct any urgent questions to the base information office. Her absence provided an opportunity to monitor news coverage more closely, but the reporting remained vague and uninformative about the actual nature of whatever situation was requiring coordinated security measures. I was updating catalog entries when the sound of helicopters became noticeable outside, flying lower and in greater numbers than the routine training flights that were common in the area. The helicopter activity continued for approximately 20 minutes, with aircraft moving in patterns that suggested coordination rather than individual training missions. The noise was unusual enough that several library patrons paused their research to look outside, though the aircraft weren't visible from our windows, and the sound faded quickly as they moved toward other areas of the installation. The helicopter activity was followed by what sounded like convoy vehicles moving through the base, though the distance made it difficult to determine their number or destination. Mrs. Henderson returned from her meeting with a thoughtful expression and news that library operations would continue normally despite the enhanced security procedures, but that staff should be prepared for possible schedule adjustments if circumstances required additional operational support. Her briefing was deliberately vague, but it suggested that whatever situation was developing might require resources from across the entire base infrastructure. "Should I be concerned about getting home this evening?" I asked, wondering if the security enhancements might affect traffic patterns or gate procedures. "Nothing that should affect normal commuter schedules," she replied, though her tone carried the careful neutrality that characterized official responses to questions about ongoing operations. "Just allow extra time for security checks and have your identification ready." The afternoon continued with routine library tasks, but the atmosphere on the base felt increasingly charged with activity that was just beyond the edges of normal civilian observation. I processed book returns and helped patrons with research requests, while monitoring the subtle indicators of elevated operational tempo that were becoming more noticeable as the day progressed. Around 4 o'clock, I received a text message from Jake that was even briefer than his morning communication. "Still working. Don't wait dinner." The message confirmed what I had already suspected about his schedule, but it also suggested that whatever crisis was demanding his attention would continue well into the evening and possibly beyond. I replied with a simple acknowledgement and expression of support, knowing that he might not be able to respond immediately, but wanting him to know that I understood the demands of his work, even when I couldn't know the specifics. The exchange was typical for periods when Jake's assignments entered classified territory, but it left me feeling more disconnected from his daily experience than usual. The end of my workday coincided with what appeared to be shift changes for security personnel throughout the base, with more guards visible at checkpoints and additional vehicles conducting patrol rounds in areas that typically had minimal visible security presence. The enhanced measures weren't alarming, but they reinforced my growing awareness that something significant was requiring coordinated response across multiple agencies and installations. The drive home took longer than usual due to increased security checks at the base exit, where guards were examining identification more thoroughly and asking additional questions about destination and purpose. The delays were manageable, but they affected traffic patterns throughout the area and created visible evidence that security concerns extended beyond routine military exercises. I arrived home to find our quiet suburban neighborhood unchanged on the surface, but my heightened awareness picked up details that might have been insignificant under normal circumstances. More official vehicles were parked in areas where they could monitor traffic patterns, and aircraft noise continued intermittently, with flight patterns that seemed more varied and frequent than typical for our location. The house felt empty without Jake's presence, but I went through the motions of preparing dinner while monitoring news coverage that remained frustratingly vague about the actual nature of whatever situation was requiring such extensive security measures. The reporting focused on traffic disruptions and flight delays without providing context about the underlying causes or expected duration of the restrictions. I had just finished a solitary dinner when my phone rang with a call from my mother, whose voice immediately conveyed the kind of maternal concern that had been building since our conversation the night before. "Sarah, honey, I've been watching the news about these security measures, and I'm getting worried about what's happening down there." The call was prompted by love rather than curiosity, but answering my mother's questions honestly would require revealing information about Jake's work that I wasn't authorized to share, even with immediate family members. Her concern was natural and justified, but reassuring her would mean either lying about what I knew or violating security protocols that governed every aspect of our lives. "Everything's fine here," I replied, using the careful language that had become second nature when discussing anything related to military operations. "The security measures are just precautionary and they're not affecting normal family activities." My response was designed to reassure without providing information that could compromise operational security, but I could detect the underlying anxiety in my mother's voice that suggested my explanations weren't completely satisfying her maternal instincts about potential dangers facing her daughter and son-in-law.
The conversation continued for several minutes, with my mother expressing general concerns about military life and the unpredictability of security situations, while I provided reassurances that were true but deliberately incomplete. The emotional cost of maintaining these careful conversations was exhausting, requiring constant vigilance about what could be shared and what had to remain protected, even from people whose only motivation was caring about my welfare. After ending the call with my mother, I settled into the living room with a book, but concentration remained impossible due to the combination of Jake's continued absence and the background noise of unusual activity that had persisted throughout the day. The evening news provided updates about flight restrictions and traffic delays, but the reporting remained focused on logistical impacts rather than underlying causes. The house settled into evening quiet, but the unusual aircraft activity continued sporadically, with sounds that suggested coordination between multiple agencies and installations, extending well beyond the normal scope of routine military exercises. I tried to maintain my usual evening routine, but every sound outside drew my attention toward activities I couldn't see, but which seemed to be building towards something significant. By 10 o'clock, Jake still hadn't called with an update about his schedule, and the combination of his extended absence and the visible security enhancements throughout the area created anxiety that no amount of rational thinking could completely dispel. I prepared for another night alone,
knowing that truly important operations could require communication blackouts that lasted for days, without explanation beyond the standard terminology of operational necessity. I was getting ready for bed when the sound of aircraft became particularly noticeable, with multiple helicopters flying in coordinated patterns that brought them directly over our neighborhood. The noise was significant enough to draw me to the bedroom window, where I could see navigation lights moving across the darkness in formations that suggested official rather than routine flight operations. The helicopter activity was followed by what sounded like convoy vehicles on nearby roads, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that characterized major military movements. The sounds were more pronounced than anything I had noticed during the previous 24 hours, suggesting that whatever situation had been developing was reaching some kind of critical phase. I lay in bed listening to the continued aircraft activity and vehicle movement, knowing that Jake was somewhere in the middle of whatever operation was requiring such extensive coordination and resources. The sounds continued well into the night, creating a backdrop of activity that made sleep difficult, despite my exhaustion from 36 hours of mounting anxiety about situations I couldn't discuss with anyone. The last thing I remembered before finally losing consciousness was the distinctive sound of what might have been large transport aircraft flying much lower than commercial traffic, heading toward destinations I couldn't identify, but which seemed to be associated with the coordinated activity that had been building throughout the day. Tuesday morning would bring answers that I never could have anticipated, but that night I fell asleep to the sound of events in motion, unaware that the careful boundaries between Jake's classified world and our civilian life were about to be eliminated entirely by circumstances that would transform our quiet suburban existence into the center of national attention. Tuesday morning shattered the illusion of normalcy that I had been desperately trying to maintain. I woke at 5:47 to the sound of Jake's key in the front door, followed by his familiar footsteps moving through the house with unusual urgency. The relief of knowing he was finally home was immediately tempered by the realization that something in his demeanor felt fundamentally different from any previous return from extended duty. "Sarah?" he called softly from the hallway, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard before. "I need to talk to you. Can you come to the kitchen?" I pulled on my robe and found him standing beside our small breakfast table, still wearing the dress uniform I rarely saw except at formal military functions. The sight was jarring. Jake typically changed into civilian clothes immediately after work, and the fact that he was still in full military regalia at 6 a.m. suggested that whatever had kept him away for 36 hours was far from over. His expression was serious in a way that made my chest tighten with anticipation. This wasn't the exhausted relief of someone who had completed a challenging assignment and could finally relax. This was the controlled tension of someone preparing to deliver information that would change everything we had carefully constructed about our life together. "Sit down," he said gently, his tone carrying the kind of careful authority I associated with his professional responsibilities rather than our personal relationship. "There are some things I need to explain to you, and we don't have much time before everything becomes very public." The phrase "very public" sent alarm bells through my mind. Jake's work existed in classified shadows that never intersected with public attention, and the idea that anything connected to his assignments might become publicly visible was unprecedented in our marriage. "What's happening?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him and searching his face for clues about the scope of whatever revelation he was preparing to share. Jake took a deep breath and looked directly into my eyes with the intensity that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully.
The situation I've been managing for the past 2 days involves a direct threat to national security that required immediate coordination with the highest levels of government. The president has been personally involved in our response, and the decisions we've been implementing will have international implications. The words hung in the air between us like a foreign language. I understood each individual term, but the combination suggested a level of responsibility and access that seemed incompatible with everything I thought I knew about Jake's role in the military hierarchy. The president, I repeated, certain I had misunderstood something fundamental about what he was telling me.
Yes, Jake confirmed, his expression growing more serious. For the past 18 months, I've been serving as the senior military liaison for a classified program that coordinates aerospace defense with intelligence agencies and international allies. The position requires direct communication with cabinet-level officials and, when circumstances warrant it, with the president himself. The revelation was so far beyond anything I had imagined about Jake's work that I struggled to process its implications. I had known his position involved high-level security clearance and specialized technical expertise, but the idea that he regularly interacted with senior government officials was completely outside my understanding of military hierarchies and operational procedures. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, though part of me suspected the answer would be even more overwhelming than the information he had already shared. Jake glanced at his watch, a gesture that suggested whatever timeline was governing this conversation was more precise than our usual casual morning discussions. "Because in approximately 4 hours, the president will be arriving here to personally thank the team that managed this crisis. The visit will involve significant security measures and media attention that will make our involvement impossible to conceal." The words hit me like a physical blow. The president coming here to our modest suburban house to thank Jake for work that I had never been authorized to know about in detail. "Here?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "The president is coming to our house?" "Not just to our house," Jake clarified, his tone mixing pride with concern about how I was processing this information. "To our neighborhood. The visit will include a brief ceremony recognizing the entire team that coordinated the response, but as the senior liaison, I'll be receiving specific recognition for the strategic planning that prevented what could have been a catastrophic situation." I stared at him in complete shock, trying to reconcile the man I had been married to for 4 years with someone whose work warranted personal presidential attention. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. This was the same person my family had been criticizing for his limited career prospects and modest government salary. "What kind of catastrophic situation?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve classified details he still couldn't share completely. Jake hesitated for a moment, clearly calculating how much information he could provide without violating security protocols that remained in effect even after the crisis had been resolved. "A coordinated cyber attack on satellite communication systems that could have disrupted everything from commercial aviation to emergency services. The attack was sophisticated enough to require international cooperation and real-time decision-making at the highest levels of government." The explanation provided context for the flight restrictions, increased security measures, and unusual activity I had been observing for the past 2 days, but it also revealed that Jake had been operating at levels of responsibility that seemed incompatible with our carefully modest lifestyle. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" I asked, beginning to understand that my assumptions about his career had been fundamentally incorrect for our entire marriage. "The liaison position started 18 months ago, but I've been working on classified programs involving aerospace defense and international cooperation for most of my military career. The secrecy requirements meant I couldn't share details even with you."
especially after your own security clearance gave you access to sensitive information at the library. The revelation that our parallel security clearances had actually created additional barriers to communication was another shock. I had assumed that my basic clearance would make it easier for Jake to discuss his work, but apparently the opposite had been true. So when my family criticizes our financial situation, I said slowly, as pieces of a complex puzzle began forming a coherent picture, they have no idea what you actually do or what you're actually compensated for this level of responsibility. Jake nodded grimly. The compensation for classified work at this level is substantial, but displaying wealth would compromise operational security and potentially endanger both of us. Everything about our lifestyle has been carefully designed to avoid attracting attention to the actual nature of my assignments. The conversation was interrupted by Jake's phone ringing with what appeared to be an urgent call from his commanding officer. He answered with the crisp professionalism I rarely heard in our home environment, confirming details about timing, security procedures, and media management that would govern the presidential visit. "Understood, sir," he concluded the call. "My wife has been briefed on the basic situation and will be ready for the advance team's arrival at 0900 hours. After ending the call, Jake turned back to me with an expression that mixed excitement with genuine concern about how this revelation would affect our carefully constructed civilian relationships. "Sarah, this recognition is the culmination of everything I've been working toward in my military career. But it's also going to change our life in ways we can't control." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that presidential visits didn't happen quietly or without significant public attention. "The media coverage will reveal my actual position and responsibilities. Your family, our neighbors, everyone who assumed I was just a mid-level technician, they're all going to learn that those assumptions were completely incorrect." The implications were staggering. My family's criticisms of our modest lifestyle and limited career prospects would be revealed as based on fundamental misunderstandings about Jake's actual achievements and responsibilities. The embarrassment would be profound, but it would also validate every choice we had made that they had questioned or criticized. "How do you feel about that?" Jake asked, clearly concerned about my reaction to having our private life suddenly exposed to public scrutiny.
I considered the question carefully, thinking about the years of careful deflection and vague responses that had characterized my conversations with family members who couldn't understand the constraints governing our daily lives. Honestly, part of me is relieved that we won't have to hide the truth anymore, but I'm also terrified about how dramatically everything is about to change. Jake reached across the table and took my hand, his touch providing comfort despite the overwhelming nature of everything he had just revealed. "The security protocols will remain in place for most aspects of my work, but the basic fact of my position and its significance will become public information. We'll need to be prepared for attention we've never experienced before." The sound of vehicles outside drew our attention toward the front window, where we could see unmarked cars with government license plates beginning to position themselves throughout our neighborhood. The presidential advance team was apparently beginning their security sweep, transforming our quiet suburban street into the epicenter of federal attention. "Is there anything else I need to know before this becomes a circus?" I asked, recognizing that we might not have another opportunity for private conversation once the official preparations began. Jake hesitated for a moment, then spoke with the careful precision that characterized his most important professional communications. "The work I've been doing has international implications that extend beyond anything we've discussed. The recognition I'm receiving today will probably lead to additional responsibilities and possibly assignments that could affect our long-term plans." The suggestion that this was just the beginning rather than the conclusion of Jake's extraordinary career trajectory was both exciting and overwhelming. I had spent 4 years assuming that his military service would eventually transition to civilian employment, but apparently his expertise was considered too valuable for normal career progression patterns. "Are you ready for whatever comes next?" I asked, searching his face for signs of doubt or concern about the path his career was taking.
I'm ready for the professional challenges, Jake replied honestly, but I'm worried about how the public attention will affect you and our relationship. This isn't the kind of life either of us planned when we got married. Before I could respond, his phone rang again with another call that required immediate attention. This time, the conversation involved coordination with Secret Service personnel who were apparently conducting final security preparations for the presidential visit. The technical language and security protocols Jake discussed with complete familiarity reinforced the reality that he had been operating at levels of government I had never imagined. As he concluded the call, the sound of helicopters became noticeable outside, flying in patterns that brought them directly over our house. The noise was significant enough to rattle our windows and confirm that whatever was about to happen would be impossible to conceal from neighbors and local media, who were undoubtedly beginning to notice the unusual activity in our typically quiet residential area. "The advance team will be here in 20 minutes, Jake announced, checking his watch again. "They'll need to conduct a final security sweep of the house and brief us on procedures for the ceremony. After that, we'll have about 2 hours before the presidential motorcade arrives." The timeline was so compressed and surreal that I struggled to process its reality. In less than 3 hours, the President of the United States would be standing in our modest living room, recognizing Jake for work that I was only now beginning to understand had been protecting national security at the highest levels. "What should I wear to meet the president?" I asked, the absurdity of the question highlighting how unprepared I was for this level of official attention. Jake smiled for the first time since returning home, his expression mixing affection with amusement at the practical concerns that were occupying my mind during such an extraordinary moment. "Whatever makes you feel confident and comfortable. This recognition is as much about the families who support classified work as it is about the individuals who perform it." The conversation was interrupted by a firm knock at our front door, announcing the arrival of Secret Service agents who would transform our home into a secure location suitable for presidential visits. As Jake moved to answer the door, I remained seated at our kitchen table, trying to process the magnitude of everything that was about to change. In 4 hours, my family's assumptions about our modest military life would be shattered by the most dramatic possible evidence that they had fundamentally misunderstood Jake's actual position and responsibilities. The criticism and concerns they had expressed about our limited prospects would be revealed as based on complete ignorance about the reality of our situation. But beyond the vindication, I felt a profound sense of awe about the man I had married and the work he had been doing in secret to protect our country. The modest house, the careful budgeting, the deflected questions, all of it had been in service of something far more significant than I had ever imagined. As Secret Service agents entered our home and began their security preparations, I realized that our carefully constructed ordinary life was about to become extraordinary in ways that would test everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our relationship. The quiet suburban existence that had protected Jake's classified work was about to be replaced by public recognition that would change everything forever. The Secret Service agents moved through our house with professional efficiency that was both reassuring and surreal. Agent Rebecca Torres, the lead advance coordinator, explained the security procedures while her team conducted systematic sweeps of every room, closet, and potential access point. Watching federal agents examine our modest furniture and outdated appliances while preparing for a presidential visit created a cognitive dissonance that made the morning feel like an elaborate dream.
"Mrs. Coleman," Agent Torres addressed me with the respectful formality that characterized all official interactions. "We'll need you to contact any family members or close friends who might visit unexpectedly today. For security reasons, no unscheduled visitors can be permitted once the perimeter is established." The request seemed routine until I realized its implications. My family had developed a pattern of dropping by unannounced, particularly my mother, who considered unexpected visits a natural expression of maternal concern. Today's presidential ceremony would coincide with my family's discovery that every assumption they had made about our life was fundamentally incorrect. "Should I explain why they can't visit?" I asked, uncertain how much information I was authorized to share about the day's events. You can inform them that official government business requires restricted access to your property today, Agent Torres replied diplomatically. More specific details will become public information once the ceremony concludes and media coverage begins. I retreated to our bedroom to make the necessary phone calls while Jake coordinated with security personnel who were transforming our quiet suburban street into a federal perimeter. The first call was to my mother, whose immediate concern about government business at our house confirmed my suspicion that this conversation would be more complex than routine scheduling adjustments. Government business? My mother repeated, her voice carrying the worried tone that accompanied any mention of military activities she didn't understand. Sarah, what kind of government business requires restricting access to your house? Is Jake in some kind of trouble? The question revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of Jake's actual position and responsibilities. In my mother's framework, official government attention indicated problems rather than recognition, and her immediate assumption that Jake might be facing difficulties demonstrated how completely she had misread our situation. Jake isn't in trouble, I assured her, choosing my words carefully to provide reassurance without revealing classified information. He's receiving recognition for important work he's been doing. The security measures are just standard procedures for official ceremonies. My mother's silence suggested she was processing this information and finding it difficult to reconcile with her assumptions about Jake's modest military career. What kind of recognition requires government security measures? She asked finally, her confusion evident despite her attempt to sound supportive. I can't provide details until after the ceremony, I replied, using the language Agent Torres had suggested for managing family inquiries. But I think you'll be surprised by what you learn about Jake's actual responsibilities and achievements. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with my mother expressing increasing curiosity about events she couldn't understand and mounting frustration with my inability to provide satisfactory explanations. Her questions were motivated by genuine concern, but they highlighted the enormous gap between her perception of our life and the reality that was about to be revealed. The second call was to Emma, whose reaction was characteristically more direct and skeptical than our mother's worried confusion. Security restrictions? Sarah, that sounds completely ridiculous. What kind of made-up ceremony requires keeping family members away from your house? Emma's immediate assumption that the official proceedings were somehow fabricated revealed the depth of her disbelief about Jake's career prospects and our actual circumstances. It's not made up, I replied, feeling a surge of defensive anger that I struggled to keep out of my voice. Jake has been working on classified projects that most people aren't authorized to know about. Today's ceremony will recognize achievements that have national security implications. The claim sounded grandiose even to me, and I could practically hear Emma rolling her eyes through the phone connection. Her response confirmed that my explanation had reinforced, rather than challenged, her assumptions about my tendency to exaggerate Jake's modest military position. Sarah, honey, Emma said with the patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being delusional. Jake works on computer maintenance at an Air Force base. National security implications is a pretty dramatic way to describe fixing software problems. The conversation was becoming increasingly frustrating because every attempt to defend Jake's actual work sounded like defensive embellishment to someone who had already decided that our claims about his career were unrealistic fantasizing. Emma's certainty about Jake's limited responsibilities made any explanation of today's events sound like desperate attempts to inflate the significance of routine military duties. You'll understand better after the ceremony, I said, ending the call before the conversation could deteriorate into the kind of argument that had characterized many recent family discussions about our choices and prospects. I need to go help with preparations. The third call was to my father, whose response was more measured than either my mother's worry or Emma's skepticism, but equally rooted in fundamental misunderstandings about Jake's actual position. His questions focused on practical concerns about security measures and their implications for neighborhood disruption, revealing his assumption that whatever was happening was routine military business rather than extraordinary recognition.
Should we be concerned about property values? He asked with the kind of practical thinking that had guided his insurance career. Government activities can sometimes affect real estate prices, especially if they become regular occurrences. The question demonstrated how completely he misunderstood the significance and rarity of presidential visits, assuming that today's ceremony might be the beginning of regular official activities rather than recognition for exceptional achievement. This is a one-time recognition ceremony, I assured him, though I suspected that Jake's increased visibility might lead to additional official attention that could affect our long-term residential situation. The government business isn't going to become a regular occurrence.
After completing the family notification calls, I returned to the kitchen where Jake was reviewing ceremony protocols with Agent Torres and several other officials whose titles and agencies remained unclear, but whose authority was evident in their confident coordination of complex security arrangements. "How did your family react to the restricted access notification?" Jake asked during a brief break in his official consultations. "About as well as you'd expect," I replied, summarizing the conversations that had revealed the extent of their confusion and skepticism about events they couldn't understand. "Emma thinks we're making up the entire ceremony, and my parents are worried that you're either in trouble or that we're exaggerating the significance of routine military duties." Jake nodded with understanding that came from 4 years of watching my family struggle to comprehend the constraints and realities of classified military work. "That's going to change dramatically in about 2 hours," he said, with a mixture of anticipation and concern about how publicly revealed information would affect our family relationships. "Are you ready for that conversation?" I asked, recognizing that the revelation of Jake's actual position would require my family to reconsider every assumption and criticism they had expressed about our choices and prospects. "I'm more concerned about how you're going to handle their reaction," Jake replied honestly. "They've been criticizing your choices for years based on information that was completely incorrect. The vindication is going to be significant, but so is their embarrassment about how wrong they were." The observation was accurate and highlighted concerns I hadn't fully considered about the emotional aftermath of today's revelations. My family's criticism had been painful, but it had been motivated by genuine care and concern about my welfare. Learning that their advice had been based on fundamental misunderstandings would be embarrassing and potentially damaging to relationships that were important to me despite their recent strain. The morning progressed with increasing intensity as additional security personnel arrived to establish perimeters and coordinate with local law enforcement about traffic management and crowd control. The transformation of our quiet residential street into the site of a federal ceremony was becoming visible to neighbors who were beginning to gather on sidewalks and peer over fences with obvious curiosity about the unusual activity. Around 10:30, Agent Torres informed us that media crews were positioning themselves outside the security perimeter and that local news stations had begun reporting about unusual government activity in our neighborhood. The coverage was speculative and uninformed, but it confirmed that today's ceremony would receive public attention that would make Jake's actual position and responsibilities impossible to conceal. "The media coverage will intensify once the presidential motorcade becomes visible," Agent Torres explained. "After the ceremony concludes, there will likely be interview requests and follow-up stories that could continue for several days. You should be prepared for significant public interest in your family and your husband's career." The prospect of media attention was overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our carefully private life was about to become the subject of public curiosity and professional journalistic investigation that could examine every aspect of our choices and circumstances. The transition from classified anonymity to public recognition would require adjustments we hadn't discussed or prepared for in any meaningful way. Jake's phone rang with a call from his commanding officer, confirming final details about the ceremony timeline and media protocols that would govern official statements and public information release. The conversation was brief, but emphasized the historical significance of the recognition Jake was receiving and its implications for his future career trajectory. "Colonel Martinez wanted to confirm that I understand the permanent nature of today's public exposure," Jake explained after ending the call. "Once the president acknowledges my role in this operation, the classified aspects of my position will remain protected, but the basic fact of my senior responsibilities will become public record." The distinction between classified details and public acknowledgement was important, but complex, suggesting that we would need to navigate ongoing questions about Jake's work while continuing to protect specific operational information that remained sensitive. The balance between transparency and security would require careful management for the foreseeable future.
As the ceremony approached, I found myself thinking about the conversation I would need to have with my family after the media coverage revealed the extent of their misunderstanding about our life. The vindication would be satisfying, but it would also require forgiveness and understanding about criticism that had been painful despite being motivated by genuine concern. "Do you think they'll apologize?" I asked Jake, though I suspected the answer was more complicated than simple acknowledgement of error. "I think they'll be shocked and probably embarrassed, but I also think they'll be proud once they understand what we've actually been building together. The criticism came from love, even if it was based on incomplete information." His generous interpretation of my family's behavior was characteristic of his approach to relationships, but it also highlighted the emotional complexity of the revelation we were about to share. The truth about Jake's work would vindicate our choices, but it would also require my family to reconsider fundamental assumptions about success, security, and the value of service that had guided their advice for years. The sound of helicopters overhead signaled that the presidential motorcade was approaching, transforming our theoretical discussion about family reactions into an immediate reality that would test every relationship we had carefully maintained while protecting classified information. As Secret Service agents made final preparations for the ceremony, I realized that the conversation with my family would be just as significant as the presidential recognition itself.
Our carefully compartmentalized life was about to become unified in ways that would challenge everyone's understanding of who we were and what we had accomplished together. The modest military wife they had been advising about career prospects was about to be revealed as the spouse of someone whose work protected national security at the highest levels of government. In 30 minutes, everything they thought they knew about our life would be proven wrong in the most dramatic possible way. The distinctive sound of Air Force One's engines became audible at 11:47, a low rumble that built to a crescendo as the most recognizable aircraft in the world passed overhead before banking toward Peterson Air Force Base. I stood at our living room window, watching neighbors emerge from their houses to stare at the sky in amazement, their faces reflecting the same disbelief I had experienced just hours earlier when Jake revealed the true nature of his work. Agent Torres spoke quietly into her earpiece, confirming the president's arrival and coordinating final security measures that would transform the next hour into the most extraordinary experience of my life. The reality of what was about to happen felt simultaneously inevitable and impossible, as if I was watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. "Mrs. Coleman?" Agent Torres addressed me with professional courtesy. "The president's motorcade will arrive in approximately 12 minutes. During the ceremony, you'll be introduced as Major Coleman's spouse and recognized for your support of classified operations that serve national security interests. Are you prepared for that level of acknowledgement?" The question forced me to consider implications I hadn't fully processed during the morning's rush of revelations and security preparations. Being publicly recognized by the president would permanently associate my name with Jake's classified work, making me a public figure in ways that would affect every aspect of our future life together. "What does that mean for my own career and security clearance?" I asked, realizing that my part-time library position might become complicated by the visibility of Jake's actual responsibilities. "Your existing security clearance will likely be upgraded to accommodate your spouse's increased profile. The recognition you're receiving today could also open opportunities for classified work that utilizes your education and capabilities more fully than your current position." The suggestion that today's ceremony might enhance rather than complicate my own professional prospects was unexpected but intriguing. I had been limiting my career ambitions to accommodate the secrecy surrounding Jake's work, but apparently public acknowledgement would create new possibilities for meaningful employment that could utilize my skills and security clearance more effectively. Jake appeared in the living room wearing his dress uniform with additional decorations I had never seen before, including ribbons and insignia that indicated levels of achievement and responsibility far beyond anything I had understood about his military career. The transformation from the modest technician my family imagined to the distinguished officer preparing to receive presidential recognition was striking and emotionally overwhelming. "How do I look?" he asked with a mixture of pride and nervousness that revealed how significant this moment was for his professional identity and personal sense of accomplishment. "Like someone whose wife should have trusted him more," I replied honestly, recognizing that my own doubts about our financial prospects had been based on the same incomplete information that had guided my family's criticism. "I'm sorry for not understanding what you've been building all these years." Jake crossed the room and took my hands, his expression mixing love with understanding about the constraints that had made honest communication impossible even between spouses with security clearances. "You couldn't have understood without information I wasn't authorized to share. Today changes that dynamic permanently." The sound of approaching vehicles drew our attention back to the window, where a motorcade of black SUVs and official limousines was turning onto our street with the kind of coordinated precision that characterized presidential movements. The sight of the United States flag and presidential seal approaching our modest suburban home created a surreal juxtaposition that would have been impossible to imagine just 24 hours earlier. My phone buzzed with frantic text messages from Emma, who was apparently watching live news coverage of the presidential motorcade and trying to understand why government vehicles were heading to our neighborhood. Her messages revealed a progression from skepticism to confusion to growing realization that something significant was actually happening at our house. "Sarah, the news is showing the president's motorcade going to your street. What is happening?" Her latest message read, followed immediately by, "This can't be real. Call me now." I showed the messages to Jake, who smiled with genuine amusement at Emma's obvious shock and confusion. "I think your sister is beginning to understand that her assumptions about my career might have been incorrect," he observed with characteristic understatement. The motorcade stopped directly in front of our house, and Secret Service agents immediately established a security perimeter while media crews positioned themselves at designated locations outside the restricted area. The transformation of our quiet residential street into the site of a presidential ceremony was complete, and the watching neighbors represented an audience for family revelations that would extend far beyond our immediate household. Agent Torres gestured toward the front door, indicating that it was time for us to take our positions for the ceremony that would change everything about how the world understood our marriage and our carefully constructed life together. As we walked toward the entrance, I caught sight of my parents' car pulling up at the outer edge of the security perimeter, where they were being questioned by officers about their purpose and destination.
"We can arrange for them to observe the ceremony from a designated family area," Agent Torres replied after consulting her earpiece and receiving authorization from senior security personnel. "Would you like them to be present for the recognition?" The question required a split-second decision about whether I wanted my family to witness the moment when their assumptions about our life would be definitively proven wrong. The vindication would be complete and undeniable, but it would also be public and potentially humiliating for people whose criticism had been motivated by genuine concern rather than malicious intent. Yes, I decided, recognizing that hiding the truth had already caused more problems than revealing it could create. They should see this. Agent Torres spoke into her earpiece, and within minutes, my parents were being escorted through the security perimeter by federal agents who were politely but firmly explaining the protocols that would govern their behavior during the presidential ceremony. Their faces reflected the same disbelief and confusion I had experienced earlier, but magnified by their complete lack of preparation for what they were about to witness. Emma arrived moments later, having apparently abandoned her car several blocks away and walked through security checkpoints while demanding explanations from every official she encountered. Her expression mixed skepticism with growing awareness that something genuinely extraordinary was happening, and her earlier confidence about our fabricated ceremony was being replaced by confused acceptance of undeniable reality. The president's limousine pulled into our driveway at exactly 12 o'clock, and the sight of the most powerful person in the world stepping onto our modest concrete walkway created a moment of cognitive dissonance that would remain vivid in my memory forever. President Harrison was taller than he appeared on television, with a commanding presence that immediately dominated the small space of our front yard, despite his warm and accessible demeanor. "Major Coleman," the president said, extending his hand to Jake with genuine warmth and respect, "it's an honor to meet the man whose strategic thinking and coordination prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on our national infrastructure." The public acknowledgement of Jake's role in preventing a national security crisis was delivered with the kind of specific detail that left no room for misinterpretation about the significance of his work. My family stood in stunned silence as the president continued to describe achievements and responsibilities that were completely incompatible with their assumptions about Jake's modest military career. The coordination you provided between defense agencies, intelligence services, and international allies during the crisis demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and expertise our country needs to address 21st century threats, President Harrison continued, his words being recorded by official photographers and media crews whose coverage would make this recognition permanently part of the public record. Jake responded with professional grace and appropriate humility, but I could see the pride in his posture as he received acknowledgement for work that had required years of preparation and expertise that very few people in the entire military possessed. The man my family had been advising about limited career prospects was being personally thanked by the president for protecting national security at the highest levels. Mrs. Coleman, the president turned to address me directly. The support you've provided for classified operations through your own security clearance and your husband's demanding schedule represents the kind of sacrifice that makes our defense capabilities possible. Your contribution to national security deserves recognition alongside your husband's achievements. The presidential acknowledgement of my own role in supporting classified work was unexpected and emotionally overwhelming. I had spent years feeling like a passive observer of Jake's career, but apparently my security clearance and willingness to maintain operational secrecy had been essential components of his ability to perform his duties effectively. As the president spoke, I watched my family's faces transform from confusion to amazement to what appeared to be genuine embarrassment about the scope of their misunderstanding. Emma's earlier skepticism had been replaced by wide-eyed acceptance that every assumption she had made about our life had been fundamentally incorrect. My mother was visibly emotional, her expression mixing pride with what appeared to be regret about criticism she had expressed based on incomplete information. My father maintained his characteristic composure, but I could see him mentally recalculating everything he thought he knew about military careers and government compensation. The ceremony continued with the presentation of official commendations and decorations that would become permanent parts of Jake's military record, followed by photographs with the president that would be distributed to media outlets and archived in presidential libraries. The formality and significance of the recognition made it clear that Jake's work had genuinely affected national security in ways that warranted the highest levels of government attention. As the official proceedings concluded, President Harrison made a point of speaking privately with my family, thanking them for their support of my marriage to someone whose work required extraordinary secrecy and sacrifice. His personal attention to my parents and sister transformed their embarrassment into pride, creating a foundation for family conversations that would be necessary in the aftermath of today's revelations. Your daughter and son-in-law represent the best of what makes our military family strong. The work they've been doing together protects freedoms that most Americans take for granted, and they deserve your admiration and support. The presidential endorsement of our choices and sacrifices was more validation than I had ever imagined possible, but it was also a fundamental change in how our family would understand and discuss my marriage going forward. The criticism and concern that had characterized recent conversations would need to be replaced by recognition and respect for achievements that had been hidden but were now undeniably confirmed.
As the president's motorcade departed and security personnel began dismantling the elaborate apparatus that had protected the ceremony, my family remained in our front yard with expressions that suggested they were still processing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The transition from skepticism to amazement to embarrassment was visible in their faces, and I realized that the conversation we were about to have would be as significant as the presidential recognition itself. The modest military wife they had been advising about financial planning and career prospects had just been personally thanked by the president for supporting classified work that protected national security.
Every assumption they had made about our life had been proven wrong in the most dramatic and public way possible. As media crews continued their coverage and neighbors gathered to discuss what they had witnessed, I knew that our carefully private existence was permanently transformed. The decision to reveal the truth about Jake's work would have implications that extended far beyond family vindication, but it also represented the beginning of a new chapter in our marriage that would be built on honesty rather than necessary deception. The strategic decision had been made for us by circumstances beyond our control. But as I watched my family struggle to process the reality of what they have just witnessed, I realized that truth, however shocking, was preferable to the misunderstandings that had been damaging our relationships for years. The hours following the president's departure passed in a surreal blur of media interviews, neighbor conversations, and the gradual dismantling of federal security apparatus that had transformed our quiet suburban street into the epicenter of national attention. As the last Secret Service vehicle disappeared around the corner, my family and I found ourselves standing in our front yard, staring at each other across an emotional chasm that 4 years of misunderstandings had created. Emma was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and what sounded like genuine remorse. "Sarah, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. When I told you Jake was just a computer technician who would never amount to anything, God, I feel like such an idiot." The admission was more direct than I had expected from my sister, whose confidence about career advice and life choices had rarely been shaken by evidence that contradicted her assumptions. Her willingness to acknowledge the scope of her error was both gratifying and painful, highlighting how completely our family's criticism had been based on fundamental misunderstandings. "You couldn't have known," I replied, though my generosity felt somewhat forced given the years of condescending advice and implied criticism I had endured. The secrecy requirements made it impossible for us to explain what Jake actually does. My mother stepped forward with tears in her eyes, her expression reflecting the complex emotions of someone whose maternal instincts had led her to give advice that was not only wrong, but potentially harmful to relationships she valued deeply. "Honey, we've been so unfair to you both. All those times we worried about your financial future and suggested Jake should find a more stable career, we had no idea." The conversation was taking place on our front lawn, surrounded by neighbors who were still processing what they had witnessed, and media crews who were packing equipment after covering the most extraordinary presidential visit our community had ever experienced. The public nature of our family reconciliation felt appropriate given how public the revelation of Jake's work had become. My father, who had remained characteristically quiet during the immediate aftermath of the ceremony, finally spoke with the measured tone he used for important conversations. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. How long have you been protecting us from the truth about the criticism we were giving you?" The question was more perceptive than I had expected, revealing that he understood the emotional cost of maintaining family relationships while protecting classified information that could have resolved misunderstandings years earlier. His recognition that I had been shielding them from the consequences of their uninformed advice demonstrated a level of insight into family dynamics that surprised me. "Pretty much since Jake and I got married," I admitted, recognizing that honesty was finally possible now that the fundamental facts about our life were public knowledge. "Every family dinner where you worried about our finances, every conversation where Emma suggested I was limiting my career prospects, every time you advised us to be more practical about our future, I wanted to explain that your concerns were based on incorrect information, but I couldn't without violating security protocols." The revelation that I had been protecting their feelings while absorbing their criticism created a moment of uncomfortable recognition for my family. They were beginning to understand that their well-meaning advice had not only been irrelevant, but emotionally painful for someone who couldn't defend herself without compromising national security. Emma sank down onto our front steps, her head in her hands, as she processed the implications of what she had just learned. "That job opportunity I kept pushing on you last week, the one at Marcus's accounting firm, you must have thought I was completely clueless about your actual situation." "I thought you were trying to help," I said honestly, though I could hear the strain in my voice that revealed how frustrating those conversations had been. But yes, it was difficult to pretend that civilian employment advice was relevant when Jake's career operates at levels that most government contractors never reach. Jake emerged from the house where he had been conducting final coordination calls with his superiors about media management and follow-up security protocols. His presence shifted the family conversation from emotional processing towards practical discussions about how today's revelations would affect our relationships going forward. "How are you all holding up?" he asked with genuine concern, recognizing that the public vindication of our choices was accompanied by embarrassment and regret that would require time and understanding to resolve completely.
My mother immediately moved toward Jake with the kind of maternal warmth that had been complicated by her misunderstandings about his career prospects. "Jake, honey, I need to apologize to you directly. We've been so wrong about your work and your capabilities. Can you forgive us for being so ignorant about what you've been accomplishing?" Jake's response was characteristically gracious, reflecting the emotional intelligence that had helped him navigate classified work while maintaining civilian relationships. "There's nothing to forgive. You were giving advice based on the information you had available. The secrecy requirements made it impossible for you to understand what Sarah and I were actually building together." His willingness to absolve my family of responsibility for their criticism was generous, but it also highlighted the complexity of relationships that existed partly in classified territory. The misunderstandings hadn't been malicious, but they had been painful and potentially damaging to family bonds that were important to both of us. Emma looked up from the steps with an expression that mixed curiosity with what appeared to be genuine respect for achievements she was only beginning to comprehend. "Can you tell us anything about what you actually do? I mean, the president mentioned preventing a catastrophic attack, but what does that mean in practical terms?" The question touched on the ongoing challenge of balancing transparency with security requirements that would continue to govern our conversations even after today's public recognition. Jake could now acknowledge his senior position and its significance, but the operational details of his work would remain classified indefinitely. "I coordinate aerospace defense systems with intelligence agencies and international allies," Jake explained, using language that was accurate but deliberately general. "When threats emerge that could affect satellite communications or other critical infrastructure, my team develops response strategies that protect both military and civilian systems." The explanation provided context for the presidential recognition without revealing specific operational details. But it was sufficient to help my family understand that Jake's work involved genuine national security responsibilities rather than routine technical maintenance. Their faces reflected growing comprehension of the scope and significance of achievements they had been dismissing for years. My father asked practical questions about career progression and compensation that revealed his business background and genuine interest in understanding the professional trajectory that Jake had been following. His questions were motivated by respect rather than skepticism, representing a fundamental shift in how he viewed military service and government employment. "So, when Sarah said you were building something together," my father said thoughtfully, "she was referring to a career that operates at the highest levels of government service. That's not what we understood about military life." "Most military careers don't reach this level," Jake acknowledged honestly. "My position requires specialized expertise and security clearances that very few people possess. Sarah's support has been essential because the secrecy requirements affect every aspect of our life together." The conversation was interrupted by approaches from neighbors who had been watching the day's events with obvious curiosity about the people they thought they knew who had suddenly become the center of national attention. The Hendersons from next door, the Martinez family from across the street, and several other residents wanted to express their amazement and congratulations about the presidential recognition.
We had no idea we were living next to someone so important, Mrs. Henderson said, with the kind of genuine warmth that characterized our neighborhood relationships. The President of the United States, right here on Maple Street. It's incredible. The neighbor interactions provided welcome distraction from the emotional intensity of family reconciliation, but they also highlighted how dramatically our social relationships would be affected by today's revelations. The modest military couple who had been quietly fitting into suburban life was now the household that had received presidential recognition for protecting national security. As afternoon faded toward evening, media crews completed their coverage, and emergency vehicles finished clearing equipment that had supported the morning's extraordinary ceremony. Our street gradually returned to its normal, quiet appearance, but the psychological transformation was permanent and irreversible. Emma stood up from the steps, with an expression that mixed sisterly affection with what appeared to be genuine respect for achievements she was only beginning to comprehend. "Can you tell us anything about what you actually do? I mean, the president mentioned preventing a catastrophic attack, but what does that mean in practical terms?" "You were trying to protect me," I replied, recognizing that forgiveness was necessary for rebuilding family relationships that had been strained by necessary deception. "Your advice came from love, even if it was based on incomplete information." "But I was so condescending," Emma continued, her voice reflecting genuine regret about the tone and implications of conversations that had been more critical than supportive. "I treated you like someone who didn't understand how the world works, when actually you were living in a world I couldn't even imagine." The acknowledgement was important for both of us, representing recognition that our relationship would need to be rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect, rather than assumptions about who needed guidance and who needed protection. Emma's willingness to examine her own behavior was encouraging and suggested that family dynamics could evolve beyond the patterns that had been established before today's revelations. My parents approached together, their expressions reflecting the complex emotions of people who needed to reconsider fundamental assumptions about their daughter's life and choices. "We want to take you both out to dinner, somewhere nice to celebrate Jake's recognition and to apologize properly for not understanding what you've been accomplishing." The invitation represented a gesture toward normal family relationships that could acknowledge achievements rather than criticize choices, but it also highlighted practical changes that would affect our social interactions going forward. Today's media coverage would make us recognizable in ways that could complicate simple activities like family dinners at local restaurants.
"We'd love that," I replied, recognizing that rebuilding family relationships would require ongoing effort and patience from everyone involved. But we might need to choose places carefully for a while. The media attention could make normal social activities more complicated. The observation about changed circumstances prompted discussion about practical implications of Jake's increased visibility that extended beyond family relationships to career opportunities, residential security, and social interactions that had previously been private and unremarkable. Jake's phone rang with a call from his commanding officer, providing updates about follow-up interviews and coordination meetings that would be necessary in the aftermath of today's public recognition. His increased profile would apparently lead to additional responsibilities and possibly assignments that could affect our long-term plans in ways we hadn't fully anticipated. As evening approached and my family prepared to leave, I realized that today's events had created opportunities for honest communication that had been impossible for 4 years of marriage. The relief of being able to discuss Jake's actual work and our real circumstances was profound, but it also represented the beginning of relationship adjustments that would take time to complete. "This changes everything," Emma said as she hugged me goodbye, her tone mixing excitement with acknowledgement of the complexity ahead. "I mean, my sister is married to someone who gets personal recognition from the president.
That's going to take some getting used to. My parents' farewell carried similar themes of pride mixed with adjustment to dramatically revised understanding of our life and prospects. Their criticism had been replaced by admiration, but the transition would require ongoing conversation and patience as everyone adapted to information that contradicted years of assumptions. As our family members drove away and neighbors returned to their own homes, Jake and I found ourselves alone in our house for the first time since Sunday evening. The quiet felt different now, charged with possibilities and challenges that came with public recognition of work that had previously existed in classified shadows. "How do you feel about everything that happened today?" Jake asked as we settled into our living room, which still showed evidence of the morning's security preparations and official ceremonies. "Relieved," I said honestly, recognizing that the end of necessary deception would improve our marriage in ways that extended beyond family relationships. For the first time in 4 years, I can talk about your work and our life without constantly calculating what information I'm authorized to share. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering practical adjustments and emotional implications of changes that would affect every aspect of our future together. The modest military wife who had been protecting classified secrets was now the spouse of a publicly recognized national security expert, and the transition would require new skills and strategies for managing visibility we had never experienced. But underneath the complexity and challenges, I felt profound gratitude for the validation that had come not just from presidential recognition, but from the family understanding that had finally replaced years of well-meaning criticism based on fundamental misunderstandings. Our carefully constructed ordinary life had become extraordinary in ways that would test and strengthen our relationship, but it had also become honest in ways that made future challenges feel manageable rather than overwhelming. The truth, however dramatic its revelation, had proven preferable to the misunderstandings that had been damaging our most important relationships. The modest house, the careful budgeting, the deflected questions, all of it had been in service of something far more significant than anyone had imagined. And now that the truth was finally revealed, we could begin building the future on foundations of honesty rather than necessary secrecy, supported by family members who finally understood the magnitude of what we had been protecting together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.